Who's here on a date? That's all? I think Curiosity Guild would be a great place for a date. I mean, you'd find out if the person likes weird, obscure trivia about flowers, and you'd have lots to talk about afterwards. But I'm not here to talk about that kind of date. I'm here about date palms. The date palm is your classic oasis palm tree. Date palms grow date fruits, which humans have been growing and eating for over 6,000 years. Now, like most fruit trees, date palms come in varieties. There's the Deglet Nur, there's the Barhi, and then there is the king of dates, the perfect date, April 25th. Wait, no. The perfect date is probably a Medjool. Medjool dates are larger and sweeter than other dates, and they're soft and delicious. People call them things like nature's candy. They were often reserved for royalty or special occasions. Their name comes from the Arabic word for unknown or mystery, so they're almost like a blind date. Like anything translated from a language that doesn't use the Roman alphabet, there are a lot of different spellings, but this is the one most commonly used in the United States. The Medjool date plant almost went extinct in the 1920s. Because of coincidence, good luck, fate, people skills, and some unsung Native American heroes, the world has millions of Medjool date trees today, nearly all of which are descended from less than a dozen rescued trees. In 1898, the United States Congress passed the Agricultural Act, which included authorization to hire and fund agricultural explorers. These agricultural Indiana Jones types were being sent out to find new plants and varieties to expand the agricultural industry, particularly to find things that might grow in some of the United States' less appealing acres. The railways were particularly interested in finding something to do with all that southwestern desert. One of these explorers was a guy called Walter Tennyson Swingle. Yes, he always went by Tenny, never Walter. His career is a whole talk in itself. He was so good at agricultural science, he got into college at 15. He got hired by the Department of Agriculture at 20. He was a plant pathologist, physiologist, plant grower. He's like the patron saint of the entire Florida citrus industry. He brought the pistachio to the United States. He went to China to collect Chinese fruits and agriculture texts. He gave us our entire fig industry by bringing the fig wasp to the United States. And he has like hundreds of discoveries and hybrid fruits and taxonomies to his name. In the 1900s, he went to Algeria and studied the soil and temperature conditions there and discovered that the North African desert is actually a lot like Coachella, or at least in the 1920s when it wasn't very interesting. So if the North African desert dates, then so can the Coachella desert, right? These early efforts kind of struggled, but by the 1920s, California had a budding date palm industry. But Swingle still hadn't been able to get a sample of that fabulous, fabled Medjool. In 1927, an unknown disease was ravaging the date palms of North Africa. The French government of Morocco invited Swingle to join an expedition to investigate. Well, this is exactly the kind of thing he loved, so of course he went. Maps. Swingle said that the expedition was on its way to the great date palm oasis of Tafialet. I get it wrong every time, and I've been there. Anyway, they'd been traveling for over 2 weeks, and they hadn't seen any date palms without disease. They reached the smaller oasis town of Beau-Denib, and then they had to stop for a week because the French army hadn't actually finished pacifying the locals. So Swingle was not the kind of guy who was actually going to sit there and do nothing for a week, so he got to know the locals, including the sharif of the entire oasis. Swingle got himself invited over for dinner in full Bedouin spread. Over lamb and couscous, he tells the Sharif how the Sharif's town can get a better price for their dates in Europe. The Sharif was very interested in this and agreed to give Swingle a tour of their extensive palm gardens. But the fungal disease was here too, and most of those groves were infected. But finally, Swingle found a grove with a different water supply, and it seemed to be untouched by the fungus. Swingle asked if he could buy some offshoots from the non-infected trees, and the Sharif said, sure, and immediately orders his men to go whack off some shoots for Walter. Yes. Swingle has those packed up and sent back to Washington, D.C. They actually made it there in less than 5 weeks, and that was just the start of what these poor little palm shoots are going to go through. These 11 shoots of Medjool palm were taken into the custody of the Department of Agriculture, which inspected them very thoroughly for signs of disease that might attack the fledgling American date industry. The plant quarantine authorities subjected these poor plants to lots of decontamination measures, including being fumigated with hydrogen cyanide. No signs of disease were found, but the authorities were not convinced that it was actually safe to plant these poor little plants. The authorities declare that the Medjool palms must be grown for several years in strict quarantine supervision in a state with no date palms in it, because diseases obey state lines, apparently. So at first that seemed pretty possible because the deserts of California and Arizona already had date palm plantations in them, but then somebody noticed the southern tip of Nevada was just sitting there. There aren't any palm growers in Nevada, so now we just need to find somebody in southern Nevada who wants to watch over some date palm seedlings. Swingle needed somebody who knew the territory, and fortunately, he knew Frank Thackeray. That's Thackeray and Swingle at the date palm experimental laboratory that the USDA had set up. Yeah, they're out there in rubber boots and ties. The 1920s were a great time, folks. Thackeray had worked with Swingle before on some earlier date palm projects and on some other projects as well. Thackeray had great relations with several of the local Native American tribes, and because of that, he'd been able to procure samples of cactuses and other rare plants for the Department of Agriculture. Now remember, this is 1927. Southern Nevada is not exactly paradise for anybody who is not a date palm tree. And all of those dams along the Colorado River that are there today have not yet been built. Also, they haven't invented air conditioning yet. Thackeray was supposed to find an isolated place in Nevada with good growing conditions for date palms, high heat and alkaline soil, and well away from any commercial palm plantations in case they caused infection. Thackeray heads for Needles. Apps. Thackeray left Indio, California in an old Model T coupe on July 3rd, 1927. He expected to spend the 4th of July alone in the desert. At Needles, he was able to get in touch with a railroad company and get his crate of Medjool date palm seedlings. Thackeray was planning to leave Needles and head north across those nearly trackless deserts, all the way up the Colorado River towards the Fort Mojave Indian Reservation. He had to find a suitable place to plant the palm trees and maybe set up a camp, hire a team and a wagon, and haul barrels of water from the Colorado River to get this started. It was a lot. The morning of July 4th, he sets out in his Model T and follows a faint wagon trail up the river into Nevada. There in the mountains, he found an isolated homestead where an old Native American couple live. Thackeray described them as an old and badly crippled man named Johnson. His wife was also very old and nearly blind. But Johnson's property included an old well, which had caved in but still had water in it, and a broken down windmill for irrigation. It looked perfect for the date palm trees if Thackeray could arrange it. Now, fortunately, there are some other Native American men visiting the Johnsons, and some of them spoke English. Better yet, one of them was a friend of Thackeray. So Thackeray, through a translator, tells the Johnsons what he wants to do with these date palms, and that he can actually pay them to take care of them. The Johnsons agreed to let Thackeray put their well and irrigation system in working order in order to care for the trees. When he asked later why he chose that spot and those people, Thackeray pointed out that being old and crippled meant the Johnsons probably weren't going to go very far. They'd probably actually stay there and keep track of those date palms. And because they were old and crippled, they probably really needed the pittance that the Department of Agriculture was going to pay them. Thackeray seemed to have been well regarded by the local native peoples, so he may have had genuinely kind motives, or maybe he just didn't want to drive any farther through the desert. When later it became clear that the Johnsons' land was not actually within the boundaries of the Mojave Reservation, Thackeray arranged to extend the boundaries so that the Johnsons could hold title to their land and home and protect the palms. Thackeray and those Native American men spent the rest of July 4th doing the hard, hot labor of digging out the well, repairing the windmill, digging the soil, and getting ready to plant those palm trees. Mr. Johnson, who Thackeray now describes as a medicine man, prays for their success. It's nearly midnight by the time all this work is done and they're ready to plant. When they open the packing cases, the plants look completely dried out, and Thackeray is not at all convinced that they've survived, but then he notices that some of the shoots are actually developing new roots, so he plants them. Thackeray came back to check on them 60 days later and found that all 11 of the Medjool shoots were showing signs of life and even growth. Mr. Johnson said he'd asked the Great Spirit to help the date palms grow. He'd also wrapped the date shoots in cloth to protect them from the worst of the sun, which shaded the palm shoots. In nature, these would have grown under the shade of their parent tree, and this is a technique they still use today in plantations to protect the young plants. A few months later, Mr. Johnson fell ill, so ill he couldn't even get up to turn on the windmill for the irrigation. His wife, who's nearly blind, does her best to care for the trees, but she doesn't see that on a really hot day, some of their dogs dig up 2 of the shoots. When Johnson gets well again, he finds those 2 dug up shoots and they are crispy. They're dried out. They cannot be saved. But the rest are okay. The Bayud fungal disease destroyed countless Medjool palm groves from northern Africa across the Sahara to the Middle East, but those 9 remaining plants in the Johnsons' farm survive and thrive for 7 more years. The Department of Agriculture and Thackeray and Swingle would visit occasionally to inspect, and they found no sign of any kind of pest or plague or fungus. In the summer of 1935, the Medjools are declared safe. And they were getting a little too big for the Johnsons' plot. Some of them were actually starting to bear fruit. These young trees were moved to the Department of Agriculture research station in Indio. From there, the Medjools were grown and budded and parceled out to other growers and eventually restored to Morocco, Algeria, and millions of other desert nations. Today, over 100,000 tons of Medjool dates get harvested every year. About half of those come from the California Date Valley. Reportedly, 6 of those original date palms are still there somewhere and still bearing fruit. When I started this project, I thought I'd be able to get more details about the Johnsons and their part in the Medjool palm journey. But despite my best research efforts, I really wasn't able to learn much more. If anybody knows what became of the Johnsons, what other names they had, none of that seems to have been recorded. So let's raise a glass to some forgotten heroes of plant history. Mr. and Mrs. Johnson, two elderly disabled Native Americans without whom we wouldn't have the Medjool date.
Check, check.